Welcome to Pleasurology Island. I'm Free Thought Steve, the free-thinking agnostic realist. Free-thinking realist. My topic today is going to be realistic ethics versus theistic ethics. Theistic ethics, God-centered ethics, is invalid because it rests on unverifiable assumptions about unobservable entities. So, realistic ethics, in contrast, is down-to-earth ethics. First, I want to talk a little bit about just free thinking, free thought, being a free thinker, and what it means in contrast to being someone who is enslaved to a theistic, delusional ideology. To be a free thinker means that we assert our right to make up our own minds about anything in life, but especially the serious things in life, the most serious things in life. And that's what religion claims to be about, is the most serious things in life. In fact, unfortunately, it has a totally imaginary concept of the most serious things in life. But we free thinkers assert our own right to make up our own minds about what we believe about the most serious things in life, such as, is there a God or not? And my position is agnostic realism. I'm a free-thinking agnostic realist, meaning I'm a realist. I believe in everything that's real, that's right around us, that we can see and hear and touch, detect with our scientific instruments, etc. Things that we can actually observe. A true statement means a statement that corresponds accurately to what we can observe about the true state of reality. And I'm an agnostic about everything non-physical, everything non-observable, everything that's not detectable by scientific instruments or by our senses. I'm a total agnostic about that. I'm a dedicated agnostic. Meaning, we cannot know anything about anything that we cannot observe. For us to make a true statement about something, we have to observe that thing and make sure that our statement about that thing accurately corresponds to the reality of that thing. And we cannot possibly make any statement about things that are imagined to exist, like gods, are imagined to exist, but they are imagined to be non-physical, which they call spiritual. But spirit is something just non-physical. So a non-physical entity cannot possibly be detected by our senses or by scientific instruments. A non-physical entity cannot possibly be observed to know whether any statement about it whatsoever is true or false, including the statement, well, it exists or it doesn't exist. I am a rigorous agnostic. We cannot state that non-physical entities don't exist. We cannot state that they do exist. The only thing we can state positively about non-physical entities, the one positive statement we can make about them is that we know nothing about them. That's what agnostic means. We know nothing about non-physical entities. And I'm a rigorous agnostic. I will object anytime anyone makes a truth claim about the unobservable, no matter what that truth claim is. It's an invalid truth claim to say there is a God, there isn't a God, there are many gods, there's a God who loves us, there's a God who wants to send us to hell. We can say anything we want about that, and none of those statements are verifiable, therefore none of them are true. We should only believe statements which we know are true because there is evidence from observing whatever it is that the statement is talking about. So I'm an agnostic realist. I believe we should look at reality as truthfully and realistically as possible and only make statements that truly correspond with the reality that we can actually observe. And as far as unobservable entities, we should make no statement about them whatsoever. We should believe nothing about them. And therefore, we should not change our own behavior one iota in order to try and please imaginary unobservable entities. But that's what theistic ethics is all about. Theistic ethics is all about living your life to try and please an unobservable imaginary entity that people make a lot of false truth claims about, based on that big compendium, that big encyclopedia of false truth claims about the unknowable called the Bible. The Bible is just a whole mass of false truth claims about the unknowable, and they are false truth claims that were made thousands and thousands of years ago. And a false truth claim doesn't become true with time. It doesn't age into being true. A truth claim about the unobservable is false now and forever until we possibly find a way of observing whatever it is that we're talking about. In which case it would no longer be something non-physical. It would be something that had some physical entity or reality to it that we could actually observe and detect with our scientific instruments. And then we could make some statements about it that were based on evidence. But until such time, any statement about non-physical entities is a statement made without any actual evidence to support that statement, to support the idea that the statement accurately corresponds to whatever the statement purports to be talking about. And the statement may be talking about something that doesn't exist at all. But theistic ethics is a whole series of rules about how to behave that are based on invalid truth claims, unverifiable assumptions about an unobservable entity, the biblical God, whom none of us have ever seen or ever will see. So, in contrast, realistic ethics is humanistic ethics. That is, it's not aimed at trying to please some imaginary supernatural being. Realistic ethics, humanistic ethics, is about trying to make human beings who really exist as happy as possible. Making ourselves as happy as possible and making the real people that we are in contact with also happier if we are able to do that. That's the simple goal of realistic ethics. And what counts is the actual happiness or unhappiness of the real human beings who are involved in the situation. And that's all that counts, because it's only consciousness, real human consciousness, that can be either happy or unhappy, experiencing pleasure or suffering, distress of some sort. And so what we're talking about is creating euphoric states of consciousness for real human beings instead of dysphoric, unhappy states of consciousness. Because states of consciousness are the only things that have ultimate value, value in and of themselves. Only states of consciousness count in the end. If something makes us happier, then the state of consciousness has a positive value. If something makes us unhappier, the unhappy state of consciousness has a negative value. And humanistic, realistic ethics is about creating real happiness for real human beings. And so it's intimately connected with my main field of study, psychology, because psychology is about human nature, and if we're going to be happy, we have to understand what our human needs are and how we can satisfy those human needs in a way that makes us happy, because satisfying our needs is what makes us happy. And as human beings, we have a whole bunch of needs, all kinds of needs. You know, we have intellectual needs. We have sexual needs. We have hunger needs. We have artistic needs. We have musical needs. We have sports needs. We have recreation needs. We have social needs, the need to interact with other human beings. And we have the need for nurturing affection. And that's something that we human beings can give each other. And if we do that, it will create euphoric states of consciousness for us. So all of these things, when we satisfy these many emotional needs, then they all make us happier. But we have to have the freedom to decide to be humanistic realists rather than being theistic delusionals, people who believe that the imaginary is real. That's the definition of a delusion, is when people believe that the imaginary is real. And so the Bible is a whole book of ready-made delusions for people to believe if they want to believe delusions. And many people prefer to believe delusions because it makes them emotionally happier. They don't care that their delusions have no real truth value. They convince themselves that they have truth value, even though they have no evidence behind them. But they convince themselves that they are true statements because if they believe those statements, their emotional brain generates euphoria in consciousness because they believe they're protected by God's magic protection. They believe that they are loved by God, so they're getting nurturing affection from their imaginary protector and imaginary parent with all these magical imaginary powers. And they believe that they're good people by doing that. And when we believe that we're good people, then our emotional brain makes us feel better. So what's the problem then? The problem is that instead of having reality-based happiness, they're having imagination-based happiness. And that's okay if you understand that it's imagination-based happiness. Like, if I'm having a sexual fantasy, and that fantasy is turning on my emotional brain, and then I'm having solo sex at the same time, masturbating and giving myself pleasure, and my fantasy turns me on, well, that's a wonderful thing. If it turns me on enough that I can have a great orgasm and satisfy my sex drive in the safest possible way through solo sex, that's a wonderful thing. That's an ethically positive thing because I have created a euphoric state of consciousness for myself, a state of consciousness which has value in and of itself because I enjoy it while it is happening. And afterwards, I enjoy the feeling of relaxation and the absence of any more sexual desire. If I've had a really good orgasm, then I don't feel driven to have sex anymore. Whereas before that, my sex drive was urging me to have some kind of sexual pleasure. So that's an example of using imagination to create euphoria and make myself happy and satisfy my sex drive. But I don't believe that I'm actually having sex with the person that I'm fantasizing about. And that's the difference. I don't believe that because Christians and other theists really believe that when they're praying to God, for instance, and they're making themselves feel better because their emotional brain believes that they are talking with an all-powerful protecting agent, a magic parent, basically, their emotional brain feels better. But then, if they also believe that their magic parent says, well, you mustn't have sex except with someone that you're married to, and you mustn't have solo sex, you mustn't have sex with someone of the same gender as yourself, you mustn't just engage in sexual fantasies even. If you unfortunately believe that the thing you're imagining is true, and if you believe that that thing truly doesn't want you to have sex and enjoy your sex drive, your natural sex drive, then you create an emotional conflict for yourself. And some people can handle that, but most people, if they're put into conflict with their own sex drive, it creates tension and anxiety. It creates guilt, it creates shame, and it creates anger at even having to feel that guilt and shame about sexuality. Why should I have to feel guilt about enjoying a wonderful experience that isn't hurting anyone else, but is just giving me euphoria? Or if I'm having partner sex and we both are enjoying it, then it's creating euphoria for both of us, and we both voluntarily engaged in it. And so why in the world should we feel guilty about satisfying our sex drive? That's one of the most pleasurable things we can do in our life. We don't need to feel guilty about it. We need to be intelligent about it so that we preserve our sexual health from STDs, and that we don't accidentally create a human life that we didn't intend to, that somebody's going to have to take care of, and that we don't break somebody's heart in the process of having our partner sex. So there are certain risks that associated with partner sex that we should intelligently eliminate from our sexual activity, and only have partner sex when we feel that it's safe to do so, it's a healthy situation, contraception is being used, and nobody's heart is going to get broken. If so, then we're just creating wonderful euphoria for each other, for both of us. And that's what humanistic ethics says is a good thing. The human beings who are involved in this situation, their consciousness is becoming more euphoric, their sex drives are becoming satisfied, so they're more relaxed and happy when they've satisfied their sex drive. They've had a wonderful euphoric experience, and so that's an ethically positive thing all the way around. No one's getting hurt, and euphoric consciousness is being created. And that goes especially so for solo sex, where we don't have to worry about getting a sexually transmitted disease or an unintended pregnancy or breaking somebody's heart. Okay? It's our own activity, and we're satisfying our own sex drive. We're taking responsibility for our own sex drive, and we are satisfying it in the most pleasurable way that we possibly can to give ourselves the most euphoric states of consciousness that we can have. And that's the best thing we can do ethically, is to create the most euphoric states of consciousness as possible in the process of satisfying our sex drive in a safe and convenient way that doesn't annoy anybody else or, seriously annoy them or upset them. But theists living in an imaginary world where they believe that their imaginary God is real, and they're getting their information from this ancient book of false truth claims about this imaginary being. And that ancient book tells them that it's a sin if you even have sexual thoughts about somebody. And if they believe that that's really true, then they're going to be in great sexual conflict. And that sexual conflict is something that those of us who grew up as Christians and have now left Christianity or in the process of leaving it behind, if we were Christians at the time that we went through puberty and had a full-on, strong sex drive and sexual desires, and we felt guilty about it, and tense about it, and ashamed about it, and angry about having to feel ashamed about it, and so forth. These emotions, if we felt them over and over, day after day, year after year, as I did, they result in a state of chronic tension in our whole body and mind, okay? It's body-mind tension, chronic tension in our entire organism. It's chronic tension in our nervous system, in our emotional brain, In our cognitive brain and our intellectual brain, there's tension and anxiety. Our emotional brain is broadcasting anxiety down into our body habitually, day after day, year after year. We are in a state of anxiety and tension that we don't even notice anymore because it's become the normal thing for us. And we don't even have a clue that we are so anxious and tense. That was how I was when I was 17 years old and took LSD for the first time. And everybody's brain has different reactions to certain chemicals because everybody's brain is different. But my brain happened to react extremely well to LSD, and it happened to be very pure LSD and very good, wonderful LSD. And it not only allowed me to open my eyes and really look at the beauty of the natural world around me, open my ears and let me really listen to music and hear the music in a way that I'd never heard it before and understand how the notes went together and how the music was put together. Above and beyond all that, it allowed me to feel relaxed for the first time that I could remember. It was such a different feeling to feel like, wow, you know, everything's all right. I don't have to be worried about anything. Everything is cool. There's nothing I have to do. I can just be right here. Enjoy being here, enjoy listening to the music, enjoy watching the little hallucinations on the ceiling, beautiful little streams of jewels, colored jewels flowing across the ceiling, making different patterns and different pictures and so forth, patterns that changed color as the music changed its mood. You know, it was a beautiful experience aesthetically, and I had no desire to do anything else than what I was doing right at that moment. Went outside, looked at the beauty of nature, and said, wow, this is such a beautiful world that if there was an entity that created this world, it's a benign entity, it's a loving entity, it's a wonderful entity. It's not an entity that I have to be afraid of in any way. I sort of lost my fear of God. My father's God, my father, the minister's God, was a scary God. He was the God that was against sex and everything else. And I could say, well, that God is too small, that God is too tiny, that God is too petty to have created this magnificent universe, this magnificent world, this beautiful, beautiful scene that I'm looking at. And I lost my fear of God, so I was okay with God. Before that, I'd been sort of frightened of the idea of God. I didn't even want to admit, once I had decided to leave Christianity about a year before, I didn't want to even admit the possibility that God existed. But then, with LSE, I could look around and say, well, if God exists, I'm not afraid of that God. It's a benign God. It's a nice God. But the main thing was that I felt calm. And I loved that feeling. And I said, gosh, I wish I could just stay calm like this forever. I just wish I could stay like this forever. And I didn't know how to regain that calmness for a number of years after that. But it was during the counterculture. I first took LSD in 1966, and then I started smoking marijuana not too long after that. And I would get high, but sometimes I would have paranoid trips. I wouldn't feel that good. Never on acid. I always had good trips on acid. But on cannabis, I could freak myself out by thinking, paranoid thoughts, basically. And I think that's probably something that's fairly common for people with a Christian background, to get high on cannabis and actually not enjoy the experience because it maybe brings up fears of hell and God's punishment and all the negative side of religion, the negative side of Christianity, can come up in your mind because cannabis, like the other psychedelics, allows ideas that we have pushed out of our mind cannabis and the psychedelics allow those ideas sometimes to come back into our mind. And that's a good thing if we can look at those ideas and face them and say, okay, these are just ideas. These are not realities. These are just things that my mind is putting up there. And I can look at them and say, okay, those are just ideas. I don't have to freak out about them. Now, how do we learn to do that? I learned to do it by doing Zen meditation, where you deliberately clear your mind of thoughts, learn how to clear your mind of thoughts for short periods of time. And that is the most useful skill that I ever learned in my entire life, along with the skill of relaxing my body with gentle relaxation exercises that I have been doing every day since I learned how to do them, because they make my body feel good, and when my body feels good, my emotions feel good, and I feel calmer. So my morning calmness routine began with stretching out my muscles, with yoga and qigong type movements, smooth, easy movements, nothing drastic, but nice and easy, made my body feel good. And then I would do some deep breathing, pranayama breathing. Prana is breath energy, and yama means an exercise to regulate the breath energy so that you get plenty of breath energy into your body. You slow down the breathing and do slow, deep breaths, rhythmic deep breaths on a certain rhythm, and that's very calming as well. And so once I had made my body feel good and gotten plenty of oxygen into my body and opened up my chest with some deep breathing, then I would relax and do Zen meditation. Now, you don't have to sit up in an upright position, lotus position or anything. You can relax. I like to relax now in a recliner chair, because then my whole body is as relaxed as possible, so my body is not distracting me with any unpleasant sensations at all. My body is relaxed, my breathing is relaxed, and I listen to special music that I've created to help me focus my attention on the music, which allows me to reduce the amount of thought activity in my brain. As long as I'm listening clearly to the music, the little voice inside my head is not talking and chattering away. So I can learn how to silence that voice by focusing my attention on the music. And then I keep my eyes relaxed, and I look at the inside of my eyelids, and I become aware of my eyes, my eyeballs, actually, because I do muscle loosening exercises for my eyes, where I follow my hand around in various positions, and I let my eyes follow my hand, and I do all kinds of different movements. And at the end, then I relax my eyes. I also do this before meditating, so that my eyes are nice and relaxed. My eyelids are relaxed. They're not entirely clamped shut. I can see a little bit down at the bottom of my eyes there, but I'm not looking at that. I'm looking at the inside of my eyelids, and I'm letting my eyes relax. My eyes are actually crossed like that, so that if I open my eyes, they're slightly crossed, but I just have them like that. So my eyeballs are completely relaxed, and I can actually feel my eyeballs being nice and relaxed. And what that does, it opens up a whole lot of space in consciousness. To have your eyeballs relaxed opens up a lot of space in consciousness, particularly if you are also not projecting thoughts into that space. When my eyes are relaxed, I'm generally not projecting visual pictures, not running imaginary movie scenes inside my head. So there's more room in my consciousness because there's no imaginary movies. The chatter in my head is quieted because I'm listening to the music, and I'm just aware of my eyes, my body, all the way down to my feet, my breathing, and the music, and I can just enjoy being calm in the present moment. And I have a few relaxation keywords that I use to say to myself, to help myself calm down emotionally. Safe and calm, peaceful and serene. Safe and calm, peaceful and serene. And I'm talking to my own emotional brain. I'm telling my emotional brain, I'm safe. There's nothing wrong here. There's nothing I have to do. There's no threat to me. I'm perfectly safe. I'm calm. I'm at peace with myself and the world. So I am peaceful and serene. Nothing's disturbing me. I am safe and calm, peaceful and serene. I repeat that enough times until I feel that I have gotten into that mood of safety and calmness, and then I can stop saying the relaxation keywords and just listen to the music and just look at the inside of my eyelids and just enjoy practicing calmness. This is calmness practice. It is the antidote for tension, the habit of tension that if we grew up in a religious upbringing and had sexual conflict, or we had an angry parent, it didn't have to be religious tension. It could be the stress of going to school and being expected to have perfect grades all the time so you could get into the best college. You had to be perfect all the time. You had to know your Bible verses. You had to go to church all the time. There were demands being made on us all the time, perhaps in relation to our religion or perhaps in relation to other things in our life that made us chronically tense, that made us develop a habit of being tense and anxious instead of calm and relaxed. So the calmness practice, the relaxation practice that I do every morning, is my way of getting into that calm emotional mood and counteracting the habit of chronic tension and anxiety that most of us have unconsciously learned from a demanding social environment, particularly a religious one, and particularly one that might be, frightening, a terroristic kind of religion, where people place a big emphasis on hell. In my opinion, people who are hell terrorists to young children as they're growing up and fill those children's minds with the belief that hell exists and that those children might go to hell if they don't behave and do what God wants them to do all the time. This is hell terrorism, and I believe it should be a capital crime. I believe anyone who does that to children should be executed. And they should know that in advance so that they don't do it. The idea is to prevent people, because I believe that every child, every human being has the right to intellectual integrity, the right to make up their own mind gradually as they grow up, what they believe about things, particularly about unobservable entities. They should not have people making unverifiable statements about unobservable entities, and hell is an unobservable entity, a non-physical entity that exists only in people's imaginations. No one's ever been there and come back to tell us about it, okay? No one can take us on a guided tour of hell, Only people can do it only in their imagination. But in fact, when people are taking young children and filling their heads with false truth claims, false terroristic truth claims that frighten the child, make the child anxious, that to me is child abuse deserving of death. Absolutely. I'm not saying we should be vigilantes at all, but I believe there ought to be a law against it. I believe that no one should be allowed to pollute children's minds with frightening imaginary images that are completely unverifiable. It's one thing to warn children about real dangers. Don't walk across the street without looking. Don't run out into the street without watching for cars. That's a real danger. That's something that's good to tell children about so they will survive. You don't have to scare the hell out of them in the process. You can say, just don't step off. As long as you don't step off the sidewalk into the street, you'll be fine. As long as you stay out of the street, there's no danger. So it doesn't have to frighten the child, but you have to be serious and say, but it would kill you if you went out in the street and that car hit you. And that's important education. That's good education. And it doesn't have to traumatize the child. The child can say, okay, fine. I will stay here on the sidewalk or on the lawn here and not run out in the street, and I'll be safe. No problem. It doesn't have to terrify a child. But when you talk about imaginary things, the thing about imaginary concepts is what the concept is about. Let's say hell itself doesn't exist. That's purely imaginary. But the act of imagining hell is a very real thing that happens in our brain. It takes a lot of neurons to actually visualize hell in our brain. And when those neurons create an image in our consciousness, an imaginary image of hell in our consciousness, that's a real brain event that is creating that image. And our emotional brain responds to that image of hell with real emotions, with real fear, with real anxiety. Anxiety that can be intolerable for people if they truly believe that what they are imagining actually exists. It can drive people to suicide. It can drive people to murder. There was a woman a mother in Puritan New England many years ago, back in the 1600s, who believed so strongly in hell, and yet she was told that there was predestination, and she might or might not be among the elect, and she wasn't sure, so she couldn't stand the fear, the anxiety of not knowing whether she was going to go to hell or not. So one day she took her baby and threw the baby down a well and killed the baby, and she says, okay, now I know I'm going to hell. And I don't have to be worried about it anymore. I know it's going to happen. I've ended the uncertainty. That's how crazy an imaginary belief can make us. Human beings have this incredible imagination, and it's a wonderful thing when we use it in a constructive way to create more happiness for ourselves by inventing new things that will make us happier, or by even creating works of art that are imaginary works of art, like a novel, a story, or something like that, that makes us entertained and makes us happier. But if we use our imagination, if our imagination actually takes over and we become slaves to our imagination, which is what happens with theists, people who believe in religion, they become slaves to their imagination. The imagination dominates them. And what it does, it forces them to inject the same delusional ideas into their children that have been injected into them when they were children. And the cycle goes on. The delusion keeps being perpetuated because part of the delusion is you will be punished by God if you don't teach your children to believe in God and hell and all the rest of that. So part of their delusion is that they have to teach it to their children. Oh, if they don't teach it to their children will go to hell. Okay? So they can do it out of love. They can pollute their children's minds out of love. They can pollute their children's emotional brains out of love. And that doesn't excuse it. It does not excuse the act of taking something imaginary, something delusional, something there is no evidence for, that traumatizes and terrorizes a child, and teaching it to the child as though it were the truth, and teaching the child to believe that it is the truth. Because children are so vulnerable, they will believe whatever adults tell them. They have not developed any intellectual defense system yet. They are defenseless in the hands of these delusion promoters, who themselves are driven by their delusion to force their delusion on their children and keep it going generation after generation. It's been going for thousands and thousands and thousands of years. It is only now, finally, we are beginning to free ourselves from the slavery of imagination, free ourselves from being enslaved to imaginary ideas that people have inherited from their ancestors. And so the people who invented those ideas thousands of years ago, they're dead, but they are still controlling the behavior and the feelings of people who are alive today. And that's fucking crazy. So, theistic ethics are based on the delusional idea that we know something about non-physical entities, and that we know that they control the world and they control us. And so theists voluntarily become zombies, serving the imaginary entities that were imagined thousands of years ago by people who've long been dead and who no longer remember that they even imagined that. Now, a realistic view of death, as I've been talking about in previous videos, a realistic view of death is we have this brain. This brain has 120 billion nerve cells in it. And it has the most incredibly complex structure. It's the most complex structure that we know of in the universe is the human brain. And it has evolved gradually from the brains of our ancestors that were not quite as complex, but even a lower, what we call a lower organism has a very complex brain, extremely complex. And the human brain is just 120 billion nerve cells. The purpose of that organ, the brain, is to create the consciousness, which is us. We are the consciousness that our brain creates. It takes 120 billion nerve cells to create that consciousness. It doesn't just happen by itself. It doesn't just happen by accident. It doesn't just happen anywhere. It only happens where there is a living brain to create that field of consciousness, that field of self-awareness that is what we all experience. Each of us experiences our own consciousness that is created by our own brain. And everything we experience about the outside world is a reproduction of the outside world that has been made inside our own brain. Our visual field is a reproduction of the external world. The sounds that we hear in our brain, in our consciousness, those sounds are created by our brain as a reproduction of the sounds coming from the outside world that hit our ears, that come to the brain. The brain generates a sound, just like the brain generates everything that we see. And that's why if you sometimes stand up too fast, if you're really relaxed, you stand up too fast and the blood kind of drains out of your brain and your heart hasn't gotten the blood up to your brain again. The brain is running out of oxygen. It has to have oxygen constantly. If it runs out of oxygen for even a few seconds, the nerve cells stop functioning. And when that happens, the first thing that happens is our visual field turns dark. It sort of granulates and gets darker and gradually disappears. But then usually our heart pumps up enough oxygen to our brain so that our visual field comes back and we don't quite black out. But sometimes we can black out and actually faint and fall over. And I've had that happen because I have sort of naturally low blood pressure, so it happens often. And it's a very pleasant experience. To lose consciousness because the brain doesn't have enough oxygen to produce consciousness is a very pleasant experience. Every time it happens, I say, oh yeah, just let this keep happening, I'm ready to go right on out, and never come back to consciousness, because this feels so good to let go of my physical sensations and the world and all my pressures and tensions, whatever they may be in my life. Just let it all go. And it's actually a delicious feeling to have consciousness evaporate due to a lack of oxygen. So the realistic view of death is that when the brain stops functioning, our consciousness, which is what we are, our consciousness just evaporates. It just quits being generated. Just like when you turn off a television set or a computer, the picture on the screen just quits being generated. And there's nothing left of our consciousness. There's no point of view outside of our consciousness that is saying, oh gosh, I don't have a consciousness anymore. Oh shucks, everything's dark. I can't feel anything. I can't see anything. And this is going to go on forever. Oh my gosh, this is terrible. I'm going to be so bored just floating here in nothingness. See, that's an inaccurate way of thinking about it. There is not going to be any point of view, any observer. Once our consciousness evaporates, our awareness completely evaporates, and we cannot notice anything anymore, including the passage of time. We don't notice that we're not there. We don't remember ever having been there. We don't regret not being there anymore. You would have to have consciousness to do that. We don't feel unhappy. We don't feel happy. You'd have to have consciousness to feel happy or unhappy. And we cannot be aware of time. Time is a quality of consciousness. So the only time we can be anything is the time that we spend being conscious. We're all going to spend a certain amount of time in our lives being conscious, and when that time comes to an end and our consciousness evaporates, we're going to forget we ever lived. We're going to forget everything we ever did. We're not going to be aware that we're not there anymore. There's going to be absolute nothingness. And that's what happens to us every night when we go through dreamless sleep. We go through about 30 minutes of nothingness. Doesn't bother us because we have no experience during that time. When you have no experience, not even the experience of having no experience, when you have when there's nothing going on at all, for no time at all, with no consciousness, that's someplace that you and I can never go. That's why Epicurus said, if I'm here, death is not. If death is here, I'm not. I have nothing to do with death. None of us will ever experience being dead. You can only experience being conscious. So there is no need to fear death. It's going to come to all of us, and it will be a release from the troubles of life. And I think that's a much happier and more realistic way to look at things. All we have to worry about is not what happens to us when we're dead. The same thing is going to happen to all of us when we die. Nothing is going to happen to us for no time at all. We're going to have nothing for no time at all once our consciousness evaporates. We just won't be there anymore, and we won't remember having been there before and not being there anymore. We won't be aware of it at all. Death is so nothing that it's just impossible to imagine it, because the only thing we can really imagine is some kind of experience. But the absence of consciousness is the absence of all experience. So it's something none of us is ever going to experience. So we should not spend any time worrying about what we're going to experience when we die. We should spend our time making preparations to die comfortably, to die easily, because there's no point trying to hang on for an extra week or an extra month or an extra year if we're in pain. Our enemy is not death. Death is freedom. Death is release. Death is complete, absence of any distress whatsoever. But our enemy is suffering while we are alive and while we are conscious to experience that suffering. That's what we don't want. So there are many painless ways to die. I think the simplest is just to be given an anesthetic. Every time I've been given an anesthetic for a minor operation or something, you're just talking along there, and then sort of all of a sudden you're not there, and you're immediately the operation is over and you wake up again. But the process of losing consciousness is not something that you're even aware of. It just, there it is. So, that would be the simplest and easiest way. And I think that is a right that every human being should have, because our lives belong to us. Our lives belong to us. They don't belong to anybody else. We're not slaves to any other human being. We don't have an obligation to any other human being to stay alive. And we don't have an obligation to an imaginary being to stay alive. That's what theists see. They get enslaved to the idea that this imaginary being created them and therefore owns them, and therefore they don't have the right to end their own life when they want to, in the way that they want to. They have to wait and suffer until they finally, or their organism finally dies. They think that otherwise God's going to be mad at them. Just completely crazy. But that's one of the things that is actually built into our legal system, making it difficult for us to choose to end our own lives. And that's one of the worst things that the theistic domination of our legal system still has in place, is the fact that it doesn't allow us to die whenever we want, on our own terms, nice and easy, with, anesthesia, so that it's very comfortable and very pleasant. Okay, and we should all have the choice to do that. But those fucking theists, those goddamn theists, say, no, the imaginary being owns everything. The imaginary being owns your life. So I'm not going to let you have the right to take your own life, to end your own life when you're ready to. No, I'm going to insist on dominating you with my imaginary ideas. And that's the fucking thing about these goddamn theists, is that they insist on imposing their delusional ideas on the rest of us. It's not just optional delusion, it's mandatory delusion. They are demanding that we all share their delusion that our lives don't belong to us. All right, well, that's just plain stupid. Okay, thanks for listening. Talk to you next time.